Welcome to Shootin' Straight. I'm your host, Ken Buck. In today's highly partisan environment, political adversaries often minimize each other's arguments by labeling motives rather than engaging in constructive dialogue. For the next 30 minutes or so, I invite you to join me as we learn about Clyde Prestowitz and how he became a leading expert on China. We will learn about Clyde's experiences in business and the Foreign Service, and we'll also hear Clyde's take on how the United States should engage with China. It is my pleasure to welcome Clyde Prestowitz to the show. Are you ready to start shooting straight?
I'm ready, thank you.
Good. So Clyde, tell me, fascinating, a young guy grows up in Delaware, goes to Swarthmore, studies in Hawaii, and ends up a China expert. How did you get there from the kid in Delaware?
Yeah, you can't plan it. But I did study in Asia. I studied Japanese, actually. Went to school in Japan, and then I went in the Foreign Service. Passed the language exams in Japanese, thinking I'd be sent back to Japan, but they posted me to Rotterdam as vice consul. So I spent a year there and then a year at the American Embassy in The Hague. And actually, I found that it was not very exciting, and so decided to go into business. And I had a scholarship in college from a guy named Tom McCabe, who was the chairman of Scott Paper Company. And so I went to talk to McCabe, and he advised me to go to work for Scott, and I did. In sales and marketing, and I was then posted in the early 1970s to Rotterdam, to Brussels, where Scott had his European headquarters, and I spent 4 years there selling, marketing Scott products, paper towels, toilet tissue, in the European Union. I got to the point in my career where I needed to do something else. It was hard for me to move at that particular point in Scott. So I went to a headhunter, and it turned out that the headhunter himself had an office in Japan, and they needed somebody in Japan, but they particularly needed an American because their clients were American. They needed an American who spoke Japanese, and I did because I had studied there. But they also wanted an American who had a European background, and obviously I did. And so they offered me a job with them, and I did go to Japan in the mid-1970s, at a time when Japan was really booming, and when Japanese exports were beginning to flood the American market, and when trade issues with Japan began to become important. And I saw how the Japanese machine was really operating, and I was operating in the midst of it. So I had a feeling for what was really happening, not only between U.S., say all U.S. auto companies and Japanese auto companies, but why it was happening the way it was.
And there's a fascinating parallel, really, that I want to get to in a little while between the U.S. Engagement with Japan and Japan's economic boom and the U.S. engagement with China, and a much different result.
The U.S. engagement with Japan was a prelude to China. You know how if you produce a new musical, before you take it to Broadway, you go to Boston or Philly? Japan was Philly, and now China is Broadway.
So let's get there. Well, I want to talk to you about how you got into the Reagan administration and after the 1980 election.
Right. So I got there by accident. A roommate of mine worked for Senator Roth here in Washington. I happened to be here in the summer of 1980. He introduced me to Roth, and Roth was a Japanophile, of all things. We had a long chat, and he asked me if I'd be interested in coming to Washington if the Republicans won in the fall. Reagan did win. I didn't hear anything, forgot about it, but in May of 1981, I got a call from Malcolm Baldrige, then Secretary of Commerce, asking me to come down and talk about working at the Commerce Department. So I eventually wound up at the Commerce Department as a counselor to the Secretary of Commerce. And he directed me, he told me, Clyde, your job is to solve this problem with Japan. And so I became the chief U.S. negotiator with Japan in the 1980s when we were having all kinds of friction with Japan over automobiles, semiconductors, textiles, and so forth.
Let's back up a little bit for history. In the 1970s, President Nixon opens the door with China.
Right.
And then you've got President Carter, who normalizes what's called normalizing relations with China, which means that we're recognizing China, and Taiwan becomes sort of an afterthought.
Right.
And so now in 1982, the first trade mission happens. You're at the Commerce Department. Right. You go to China. What is your impression when you get to China?
Incredible poverty. No automobiles on the road. Everybody riding bicycles. Everybody wearing black Mao suits. No stoplights in Beijing. Tallest building, 10 stories high. I mean, really, really poor. Shockingly poor. And I thought at the time it's going to be a long time before China becomes a serious economy. And I was mistaken in that, of course.
What was the goal?
The goal, exactly. The goal was we had taken a lot of American business leaders with us on this mission. And the goal was for them to get into the Chinese market, for them to sell to China, but also to invest in China, to begin making things in China, and exporting them to the U.S. And over that economic goal, there was a broader overarching goal, which was to liberalize China, to have China abandon communism and become a liberal, if not a democracy, a much more politically liberal, open kind of regime.
So we saw it happen in Japan, and the idea was, well, if we show them freedom and our values,
right,
how could they make any other choice?
Right, exactly. And we had seen it happen not just in Germany, in Japan.
Sure.
So yeah, of course, they're going to be like us. They'll be free and democratic and so forth.
And President Reagan's vice president, George Bush,
H.W.
Bush, was an ambassador to China from the U.S.
Exactly. Yeah.
And had this great interest in China. Did he have influence also with Malcolm Baldrige and others?
At one point, President Reagan had come back from Japan after some difficult trade negotiations, and he had designated Vice President Bush to follow up on the discussions that Reagan had had in Japan. And so a kind of a team was put together around Bush. I was designated to be on this team to help Bush follow up the Reagan discussions. And as I worked on that team, we were dealing with Japan, but I came to understand from getting to know Bush that he had a real soft spot for China. He had loved being ambassador to China, and he had developed an affection for the Chinese people. Some of his servants in China had gotten to his heart. And he had what I would call a kind of a missionary attitude towards China.
Let's fast forward, 1989.
Right.
Big event happens in China.
Tiananmen Square. The students are demonstrating peacefully in Tiananmen Square. And Deng Xiaoping sends in like 2,000 tanks. The number of people who were killed ranges from 700 to 7,000, but a lot of people were killed.
Let's stop there. 700 to 7,000.
Right.
You know, in this country, we can identify this many people, were killed by police officers. This many people were killed by gang members. Why is the spread between 700 and 7,000?
Well, as you know, the Chinese government today does not celebrate June 4, 1989. In fact, in Hong Kong this year, this will be the first year in Hong Kong since that time that there will be no remembrance of Tiananmen Square in Hong Kong. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't want to hear about that. However, the number 700 is a number that in secret, it's a number that the Chinese Communist Party will agree to. But there are estimates by, for example, the British ambassador who was there at the time of as much as 10,000. And so it's all over the lot, but you can't go to the archives in China and get the number.
So after Tiananmen Square, most of us would think, okay, we've got an issue here. We've got this repressive country. We're going to withdraw. We're going to isolate this country and try to bring it into the fold.
Right.
Well, what happens?
An important point here is that this is 1989. So remember, the wall has fallen in East Berlin. The wall is down. Soviet Union hasn't collapsed yet, but it's looking very shaky. And so there's a feeling in Washington that we're beginning to witness the end of tyranny, of communist tyranny. And we had welcomed the students in the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square as the evidence that the Chinese are also demanding freedom. And so it was a shock. And
Tiananmen Square was a shock.
Tiananmen Square was a shock to the world, but a shock to Washington. And I'm sure it was a huge shock to President Bush. And it was a moment when, had Bush, in my view, been tough, and had he made a condition of further economic interaction, that China withdraw from this very harsh treatment, that he could have had a big impact. But Bush didn't. For whatever reason, he, as I said, he had affection for China. Bush had faith that free trade, capitalism would automatically bring democracy with it. So he sent Brett Scowcroft, his national security advisor, immediately to meet with Deng Xiaoping to tell Deng that Bush, would keep the boats from rocking too much. And Scowcroft added to that, in personal comment to Deng, that George Bush is your best friend in the world right now. And then subsequent to that, some leading American business people like Bob Galvin, the chairman of Motorola, and others were encouraged to go to China and begin investing as a signal that America wasn't going to hold this against Deng. Now, shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union did collapse. And so in a way, I believe that confirmed in Bush's mind and in the mind of many American leaders that the future of communism was bad and that they were doing the right thing by continuing on the path of helping to develop China. But you remember also that at that time, 1992, Francis Fukuyama, scholar at Stanford, had written a book called The End of History, arguing that this collapse of the Soviet Union and the apparent turn of China onto the capitalist road was going to result in a global system of democracy and free markets. And at that time, Deng Xiaoping said in a statement that most people are unaware of, we need a new Cold War. So in Deng's mind, the Cold War wasn't over, although it was in the minds of many people in the West.
And so we have this situation where America is almost doubling down on a policy, believing that if we can just get China engaged in a world economy, it will liberalize its policies at home.
Absolutely. And you may recall Bill Clinton campaigned for president. On his campaign platform was no coddling of dictators from Baghdad to Beijing. But as soon as he became president, he changed his tone and he began talking about positive engagement. And positive engagement meant that we send trade missions to China. We encourage American businesses to invest in China. In 1997, the Chinese did something that should have been recognized at the time as decoupling. It should have been recognized at the time as a Cold War kind of measure. And that was, they built the Great Firewall that separated the Chinese internet from the rest of the world. And they banned Google and they banned Amazon and Facebook. Any company that had anything to do with the internet, they kept out of China. So if you're in China, you Google for Tiananmen Square, June 4, 1989, it won't pop up. So that was a Chinese declaration that we are not going to be joined elbow by bone with you guys. It was a Cold War kind of statement. But Bill Clinton reacted by saying, ha, ha, ha. them Chinese trying to control the internet will be like trying to nail Jello to a wall. I like to see them try. That was the attitude. Well, they did try, and they do control the internet in China.
In the 1990s, we sort of saw a Wild West economy. We saw all this investment from not just American companies, European companies, others into China because of the huge market. It was an opportunity for us to sell there, but it was also an opportunity to as we were talking about, get China to move forward, progress on some policies that they just didn't.
That's right. That's right.
But they became a richer repressive regime as opposed to a less repressive regime.
I mean, let's say that the regime was, in a way, less repressive, certainly than Mao. So, the repression that we associate with Mao Zedong fell away in the 1980s and 1990s. And we interpreted that as it was all moving in our direction. What we're not aware of was Deng's comment that, of course, if we open the windows, a few flies will come in, but we can handle the flies. Deng was handling the flies, and that was what Tiananmen Square was about, handling the flies. But they welcomed the investment. Another very important point is that, yes, American companies, some of them were making money by producing and selling in China. But where they were really making money was producing in China and selling in America. They could get rid of their labor unions in America. They could go to China and pay wages that were a fraction of the wages they were paying in the U.S. They didn't have any pesky environmental requirements. Typically, the Chinese government would give them the land free, would sell them the utilities at half price. In some cases, the Chinese government would invest and make a partial investment in the company. So the American companies were making out like bandits by moving their production offshore to China and selling back to the U.S. Walmart, 80% of what Walmart doesn't produce anything. 80% of what it sells is made in China. And that's where they were really making money.
So in 2018, there's an Economist article that sort of looks back on the world. Tell us about that.
One step in between. China in 2001, we bring China into the World Trade Organization.
Right.
And we do that because our businessmen are really pushing us to get China into the World Trade Organization. Prior to that, we had been giving China what we called most favored nation treatment. In other words, we'd have been applying the same tariffs to them that we applied to the rest of the world. But that had to be voted by Congress every year. And every year it was a big fight to get the Congress to pass that. That gave us leverage, however, over China. We could always say to the Chinese, look, if you don't loosen up a little bit in China, no more MFN. But companies wanted to get rid of that, and they did get rid of it, and we brought China into the WTO 2001. Now, when the U.S. Trade Representatives, Charlene Barshevsky and Mickey Chanter, when they went to Congress to sell this deal to Congress, they told the Congress that our $100 billion trade deficit at that time would be cut in half by doing this deal. And why would it be cut in half? Well, because we already had low tariffs. The Chinese had high tariffs. So the cutting of tariffs to get into the WTO would all be done by China. We wouldn't have to do anything. And so with their low tariffs, then we'd be able to get to export. By 2018, so at that time, our trade deficit with China was $100 billion annually. By 2018, it was $600 billion. Everything went the wrong way. Those forecasts were complete baloney. The models that were used to do those forecasts were fraudulent. So anyhow, we get to 2018, and obviously, not only is China not coming our way economically, but now we have Xi Jinping in office, and Xi is tightening up, and he's getting rid of the, there were American and other foreign civil society activities in China. Deng throws them out. Deng throws out a lot of the newspaper correspondents who are in China. Things tighten up. In 2015, China publishes its next 5-year plan, and the title of the plan is Made in China 2025. And it identifies semiconductors, airplanes, robotics, artificial intelligence, biotech, all of the top key leading edge technologies China says we're going to do all this in China by 2025. So this is the opposite of what the WTO is supposed to be all about. And finally, on March 1st, 2018, The Economist magazine, long the high priest of free trade, of globalization, a big supporter of coupling with China, they run their cover story and it says, the West made the wrong bet on China.
What does bet mean?
Yeah, exactly. And what bet means is the West was betting that all of this globalization and economic coupling and integration would lead to political liberalization. Well, what The Economist was suggesting was that the Chinese had made the opposite bet. They had bet that they could do all the economic growth without the political liberalization. And what The Economist was saying was, hey, Chinese bet was the right bet.
Helping China develop wealth from the country that you saw in 1982 to the country that exists today, helping them develop wealth created what?
It created a daunting opponent. It created it created a country, a system that is diametrically opposed to the fundamental values of the American democracy. And it empowered that system to challenge the American democracy.
Let's talk about some of the American corporations and their role in this. Right. And obviously, corporations, some may say are amoral, some may say are immoral, but they act for business profit. They act in a way that government allows them to act. There are restrictions in some ways, but they act for profit. Yeah. Take a company like Apple. Yeah. What has Apple done in China and your experience, your first interaction with Apple, and to where they are today?
Well, my first interaction with Apple was in 1982 when a guy named Steve Jobs called me up.
That's pretty cool.
It was cool. And he was having trouble getting his then Apple III desktop computer into the Japanese market. He wanted help. And so I put together a team at the Commerce Department, and we managed to persuade the Japanese to allow Steve to sell Apple computers in Japan. It's important to understand that those Apple computers and now the Apple iPhone and all the other Apple gadgets were products that evolved from programs that have been funded by the U.S. Defense Department, by the Small Business Association loans, by the National Science Foundation. Everything that Apple made then and makes now originated with U.S. taxpayer money. And so great, Apple makes these great products and it's making them in California and it's paying good wages to a lot of California workers and it's exporting them and it's making some offsetting the U.S. trade deficit in some ways. And then in 1998, Steve Jobs brings a guy named Tim Cook into the fold to put him in charge of overseeing the logistics and the manufacturing of Apple. And Tim has worked with other companies in China, and he convinces Steve that, hey, we're paying these workers here in California, I don't know what, maybe $10 an hour. Hey, we can pay them $1 an hour in China. Let's move everything to China. And so Apple duly closes up their operations in California. They get rid of the American workers, and they move to China. Initially, they're essentially assembling their products in China. But as time goes by, assembly draws more things into it, and more things begin to be developed in China, and the value added in China becomes higher and higher. And Apple, of course, becomes the world's most valuable company. It makes almost nothing in the United States. It has a big market share in China. But it, of course, also exports around the world from China. It's the world's most valuable company, but it has become essentially an agent, a hostage of China.
How?
Because the Chinese Communist Party has a kind of control over any corporation in China. So here in Washington or in the United States, Apple can go to court against the U.S. government. In fact,
it has.
It has. In the past, the FBI has tried to get Apple to cooperate to open phones to get information. Apple absolutely.
And let's back up a second. I remember one case where the FBI tried to get Apple to open up a phone of a terrorist who had been killed in a shootout.
Exactly.
And they wanted to find out if there was a terrorist cell in America and be able to protect American citizens with that information.
Yes.
Apple refused to turn over that information.
Right.
The U.S. Department of Justice goes to court, tries to force Apple to do it. Apple fights every step of the way.
Right. And eventually, the FBI found an outside technician who could open the phone. So the court cases were dropped, but Apple never helped.
Apple never helped. No. And their really their message, their marketing message to Americans is, we care so much about your security, your privacy, that we will not cooperate with the government.
Right. Exactly.
Now what do they do with China?
Okay, so now you get the fast forward to 2019, and students are demonstrating in Hong Kong. And Apple has an app in its app store called Hong Kong Map Live, which allows the user to see Hong Kong in real time. So the students were using this, and they were looking in Hong Kong, and they were saying, well, okay, the police are over here, so we'll go over here. Chinese Communist Party hated that app. And the Chinese Communist Party newspaper began inveighing really hotly against the app. Within 2 days, Apple yanks the app out of the App Store.
And what did they say?
And they said, well, we wanted to protect the students in Hong Kong.
Of course they did. I mean, it had nothing to do with profit.
They're totally captive, And the way, there's a thing called the death of 1,000 cuts. So this is the way China operates. It's not like the government comes in and says, we're going to file a suit against you if you don't do X, Y, and Z. The government says, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, things could happen. And then the next day you find out that, you don't have any water, or the doors are all locked. I mean, it's all coercion. And so any major company that's operating in China has no ability to really oppose the Chinese government. And so it becomes the CEOs of global companies operating in China. We think that they're CEOs of American companies. They're Chinese. They're agents of China. And it's not just Americans, it's Europeans.
It's a pretty radical statement.
But they are agents of China. Yeah.
We have organizations in America that promote, as part of their mission, American business. And one is the U.S. Chamber.
Right.
What is your observation about the U.S. Chamber and its interaction with China?
Well, if you look at the board members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, you'll see that many of them have extensive operations in China. So I view the Chamber of Commerce more as a lobby for China than as a lobby for American business. Or maybe it's a lobby for American business in China, but the point is it's not for America. It's not thinking about what's good for America. It's thinking about what the Chinese tell the CEOs they need to do in order to continue doing well in China.
We have a problem right now. And really what I want the viewer and listener to hear is, where do we go from here?
So I think there's two things. A lot of the discussion of where do we go has talked about how expensive it is or how the Chinese cheat. And we have to somehow force the Chinese to play fair and to play by the rules. So the first thing that's absolutely critical is to recognize the Chinese are not going to do that. We cannot negotiate the Chinese into playing the game our way. They're not going to do it. And so we therefore need not to worry so much about China, what China does, but what the hell we're doing. And my view is, let's start with Made in China 2025. Those are the leading edge technologies. And China has already taken big steps in those technologies. So if you look at 5G telecommunications, China is way ahead of America in that technology. The implications of that are stunning globally. It effectively means China has the potential to listen to every bloody conversation in the world, and we don't. So if you look at semiconductors, right now the U.S. has leadership in semiconductor technology. That is very, very critical to defense, to free speech, to everything that we stand for, to maintain that leadership. But we have been losing that leadership. It's, in my view, absolutely essential that the United States maintain leadership in these fundamental, or that the free world, doesn't have to be the United States per se, but the free world, maintain leadership in these fundamental high technologies, because the implication is not just business. It means that you lose your freedom. You lose the right of free speech. Look at what's happening in Hong Kong right now. My friend Jimmy Lai, the owner of the Apple, the only independent newspaper in Hong Kong, is in jail. Why? Because he believes in free speech. So allowing China to become the leader and a dominant player in these leading edge technologies is effectively surrendering the values of the United States, and we just can't allow that to happen. Now, in the past, we have faced similar challenges. Remember Sputnik? We were behind in satellite technology back in the 1950s. We caught up. We made a decision to go to the moon. We need to make similar decisions to go to the leadership in semiconductors, leadership in 5G, leaderships in robotics, between us and our ally, our free world allies. That is, yesterday I was on a Larry Kudlow show, and he made the point that solar technology, solar panels and solar technology depends on rare earth. And most of the rare earths today are mined in China. And he was saying, maybe we shouldn't go to solar because we'd be more dependent on China. And I understand that concern. My view is that, no, we have rare earth in the U.S. We stopped mining it years ago because it's polluting. Well, damn it. We need to mine the rare earth in the U.S. and find a way to stop the pollution.
And we do it right. We do the control of pollutants a lot better than China does.
Exactly right.
Yeah. They burn our coal to produce products at a lower cost and then sell them to the United States.
Exactly,
and if there is truly a global concern, it is a global concern in China. Yeah. So you wrote a book. Tell us about the book.
Yeah.
The World Turned Upside Down.
So this book originated in a telephone call, another out of the blue telephone call. I'm walking around minding my own business in February of 2018, and I get a call from the representative of the Smith Richardson Foundation, Alan Saul, Smith Richardson Foundation. And he says, Clyde, would you have a reputation for being kind of an outside the box thinker. He said, we need some outside the box thinking on China. He said, would you be interested in writing a book on how we should deal with China? And I thought about that for a half a second, and I said, yes. So I had to, of course, write an application and a proposal. But anyhow, I was fortunate to get this grant from the Smith Richardson Foundation. And so I wrote the book. And there were two or three kind of key messages that I wanted to get across in the book. One of the messages I wanted to get across is what you and I have been talking about today, which is that China has not been and is not going to become the nice, fuzzy, capitalistic, free market, politically liberal country that we so much wish that it would be. The second point I wanted to get across is that what China is doing economically is very impressive. And in fact, it's not that different from what we did or what other countries have done. So I mentioned that Japan, I was involved in Japan, and I watched them grow economically, and I negotiated with Japan. So if you write a new musical, before you put it on Broadway, you take it to Boston. Japan was Boston. Broadway is China. China is doing pretty much what Japan did, only better. Pretty much what Korea did, only better. Pretty much what Taiwan did, what Germany did, in fact, what we did. Remember, America, how did America get rich? We got rich because Alexander Hamilton won the argument over Jefferson. Jefferson wanted a country of yeoman farmers. Hamilton wanted a country of manufacturers. They argued until the War of 1812, which we almost lost. Having almost lost it because we didn't make anything, Jefferson changed his mind. From 1815 until 1948, America played the same game as China. We had high tariffs. We stole British technology. We subsidized the railroads. We subsidized the telegraph. We played a mercantilist industrial policy, build manufacturing game, just as Germany did, just as Japan, just as Korea and others. So what I want to get across is that our economic thinking, our economists who have been teaching us that free trade is nirvana are wrong. And I want us to play the game much more as we used to and as China is doing. And then the third thing that I want to get across is that what the stakes here are not fundamentally really economic. You hear so oftentimes in the discussion of decoupling from China, many people say, oh, but it'll be so expensive, so costly. I mean, imagine if poor Apple has to pull its manufacturing out of China. It'd be such a huge hit to Apple. And when I hear that, I think of my friend Jimmy Lai. So Jimmy Lai's company, his newspaper is called The Apple. Think of two apples. Here's Jimmy Lai. His newspaper called The Apple. It's the only independent newspaper in Hong Kong, and Jimmy Lai's for free speech. He's in jail. Tim Cook runs Apple. He makes iPhones, and he's an agent of China. Now, how expensive is it? How many iPhones does it take for Jimmy Lai's life? That's the game. Those are the stakes. We can't abandon Jimmy Lai. We can't abandon our fundamental values so we can sell a few more iPhones.
We also can't abandon our allies in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan.
Yes.
Hong Kong is now gone. It is under the control of a repressive regime, and it's just going to get more repressive. But certainly if we are going to have any chance at maintaining freedom, we have to recognize the Philippines. China is more and more aggressive now in the Philippines. So, Clyde, I ask every one of my guests a fun question. I want to just ask you this question. If loving this is wrong, I don't want to get right. I don't want to be right. What is this?
This is being tough. This is making the hard decisions. It's going to be costly, but we need to recognize that the price is worth it.
I want to thank Clyde Prestowitz for shooting straight with us, and I want to thank you for listening today. I hope this program has been informative, enlightening, and uniting. As Americans struggle with the difficult issues facing our country, we are reminded that good policy is the result of open, thoughtful discussion. For more Shootin' Straight programs, go to my website, shootinstraightpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this show and have ideas about future topics or guests, shoot me an email, ken@shootinstraightpodcast.com. God bless you, and remember to always shoot straight.